Okay, so what we're doing today, guys, is we are looking through, or we're going to quickly go over this PowerPoint, which I gave you guys last Thursday. It's about reflective commentary, or what we call as the FLAPC. And obviously, it's going to tell you guys about what you need to do for tomorrow afternoon SAC, which is our SAC 3. Just quickly first, what's a definition? So what is reflective commentary? Usually in our school, we call it the written explanation. And on your SAC booklet tomorrow on the front page, it will say written explanation. So don't get mixed up. But it's often known by a multiple, number of names. Vika calls it the reflective commentary. That is the new terminology for this study design. But it's also known by a few different names. For example, FLAPC, for example, statement of intention, because it is a statement of your intended choices that you made. Okay, just like when we studied Things Fall Apart and we talked about the authorial intention, for example, that Achebe deliberately included proverbs. Why did you, now that you're the author and you're in the author's seat, why did you include specific things like humor? Or why did you include rhetorical questions in your written piece? That's kind of what we are talking about. Now, the reflective commentary, the purpose behind it is to give you guys an opportunity to explain the reasoning. Hold on, I want to use a pen. The reasoning and the intention behind the choices that you made as an author when writing SAC 1. So we're not talking about here, the one that you did all together in the multipurpose hall. We're not talking about that one. That was the V-class style one. We're talking about the first one that you did over the multiple sittings in class, that SAC 1. Where you had the stimulus and the prompt. That is what you are writing your written explanation for. Now, the reflective commentary in terms of length, it is going to be shorter than your actual writing pieces that you did for SAC 1 and SAC 2. It's going to be 500 to 600 words. Depending on your handwriting, some of you could get away with 1.5 pages or 2 pages. All of you have different size handwriting, so it really depends. Obviously, in the reflective commentary, and the reason we always refer to this as FLAPC is because from many years you guys have heard of the word FLAPC, and FLAPC is a really good way to structure and to remember what are the different things you need to include. So obviously that's F for form, L for language, A for audience, P for purpose, and C for context. If you remember when we did the 3 mentor texts in class, we kept going over the CAP or the CAP, okay, the context, the audience, and the purpose. And that is kind of what you now have to evaluate for your own written text that you did as well. Now, the reason that we're emphasizing a lot on the written explanation, guys, is because, and we don't want you to just be like, oh, I can just yap and I can just write like nonsense and get away with it. We want you to really give us good detail. We want you to really get a little glimpse into your mind. Why did you make the choices that you did when writing your creative piece? You might think that I was just going with the flow, but actually there is an intention behind why you did everything the way that you did and why you chose the language that you chose, why you chose your character to be set in, I don't know, the 1900s instead of, the 21st century. I don't know. So you need to explain clearly what your intentions were. Also, you need to remember, guys, the reason we're stressing is that it will contribute to the same mark. So your tomorrow SAC is out of 20 and it's the exact same weighting as your other 2 creative SACs. So it's still going to be worth 5%. And the way that you can get these marks is number 1, by doing all of the FLAPC.
No, wait. No, wait.
Oh, we're learning that.
Oh, wait. Wait.
Wait, can I mute her? Okay, that's okay. All right, so as well as for the other 2 creative SACs, guys, we need to make sure that we want to include as much detail and as much explicit links back to SAC 1. That could include you quoting information from your SAC 1 to do that. Okay, so that can actually be a good way for you to improve your mark. Instead of just saying something like, oh, I used rhetorical questions, you can actually say, I used rhetorical questions, and you can say such as, if there are 2 rhetorical questions that were meant to have different effects, for example, if one rhetorical question was kind of supposed to be humorous and another rhetorical question was actually meant to get the audience to think about an issue, if you're doing a speech, you might actually contrast between the different types of rhetorical questions you have then used. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. Also, I just gave you an example with the word I. I know a lot of the time in text response, we always say don't use I. Reflective commentary is somewhere where you have to use first person because it's your writing. So you must use I, you can use my, you can use me. For example, you might say that I used humor because I always feel like, looking at the bright side of a situation is very important. And, that's just a part of like who I am. And, it's a part of my personality. Okay. It is important to me. So you can use those kinds of words and those kinds of terminologies there. Okay. I got a question here. What's the audience for a letter? So if you've written a letter, your audience will mainly be your, person who is receiving your letter. So your recipient, the person who you're sending the letter to, in other words, as well as if that's a letter not only meant for that participant, or sorry, not only meant for that person, but also meant for family members. You can also say, well, indirectly, the audience may also end up being blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's the idea. Okay, do we mention VCE students? No, if your letter is not to VCE students, you don't need to mention VCE students there. You just need to talk about what's happened to my PowerPoint. You just need to say who the audience is in terms of the person receiving the letter. It's usually just one person because letters are not sent to multiple people most of the time. Unless you've written the same letter and you're sending it to 5 of your friends, well, that's going to be a different story. But I don't think any of you did that as far as I remember. Okay, so anyway, let's move on to the actual, hold on, I need to scribble, get rid of all the scribblings. How do I do this? Clear all drawings. Okay, good. All right, so now let's look at this, the main FLAPC components. So obviously, F stands for form. So the form is basically what form you chose to write in. We gave you a list of forms that are VCA approved. So most of you have obviously selected one of those forms. Hold on. Okay. Let me see. Miss, how about if I'm just reading a question. How about if like we didn't write about ourselves and instead wrote it in the perspective of a random made up character? That's okay. It's still your writing at the end of the day. You would bring that up in terms of language. You would bring up the fact that you have chosen a specific persona. So the word is persona. Or you can say you have chosen a specific voice. You've chosen the voice of a 36-year-old male, or you've chosen the voice of a 12-year-old girl, or you've chosen to adopt the persona of a, I don't know, 86-year-old grandma or something like that. So you'd use either the word voice or persona, and you would then bring that under the banner or the heading of audio, of language, sorry. Yeah. Okay, no issues. All right, so where was I? Yeah, form. So obviously form is you have to name what form you chose. So just off the top of my head, I'm just trying to remember what forms you guys were doing in class. I think majority of you were doing either speech, series of diary entries, letters. Oh, sorry, not just one letter, but like a series of letters, like back and forth. What else? What else did some of you did personal reflective essays, similar to the form that Amy Jung uses in Red Plastic Chair. Yeah, those were kind of and speech. I think I mentioned speech already. So those were like the majority of forms that you guys were using. So obviously you would name the form that you've chosen, and then you need to explain why. Why is where you're getting the marks here. You need to say, or you need to justify, why did you choose to write in one form rather than another form? And so a lot of this, hold on, I need to open up my texter again. So a lot of what the reason of why you chose a specific form, okay, comes down to the mode. Okay, so if I put an arrow down here, comes down to the context as well. For example, when you chose to write a speech, you knew that the speech would be, delivered in a public setting, in a public platform. Generally in speeches, people are a little bit more public with what they say, but they also know that because they're speaking to a wide audience, they can't just say anything that comes to their mind. So in a way, they do have to kind of limit certain things that they say. We know, however, if you've chosen to write a series of diary entries, or you're writing a personal letter to a close friend and they're the only ones that are going to see the letter, you know that that's a little bit more private, and you have the scope to now, share your feelings in a more intimate and a more honest way. You have the, ability to then kind of talk about things that normally would bring shame for you to then bring up in a public setting, but you can talk about it in a more honest way. So the form or the type of thing that you've chosen to write in will obviously be influenced by whether you wanted the content or the ideas about personal journey that you bring up in your speech or that you bring up in your diary entries, whatever form you've chosen, to actually be something that you want everyone to know about. Like Adichie said, she wanted everyone to know about the danger of a single story, or whether you want only specific people to know about that specific thing. Okay. For example, I noticed a lot of you who are bringing up issues of like internal anxiety, the character experiencing a lot of self-doubt, a lot of shame. You kind of stuck to like diary entry type things. Whereas some of you who are just talking about general personal journeys and general struggles that you were obviously happy with to talk about in front of a group of people were opting for speech. So just think about the reason why you chose that form. Okay, there must have been a reason there, because I remember in class a lot of you were experimenting with different forms. So why did you end up, for example, writing a speech for your SAC instead of something else? Why was that something important for you? Okay, and why was, for example, your eventual choice of writing a speech allowing you to better communicate your ideas about personal journey compared to using another form like diary entries or letters? Like, why was that more effective? So that's what you would put under form. The next criteria will make up a pretty big chunk of your written explanation tomorrow, which will be language. So obviously each of you are writing in a different form for a specific audience with a specific purpose in a specific context. The language that you use really affects this, okay? So a lot of your characters or a lot of the people that are the focus of your creative writing for SAC 1 would have had a specific cultural background, okay? And so some of you have opted to choose to include non-English words or other language words, and that's fine. Why did you choose to include those specific words? For example, we know that sometimes you say something in your own language and it just has a more profound meaning, but when you translate it to English, it just loses that entire meaning. So that might be something you want to bring up in your writing, or when you justify why you chose to include non-English words, if that is something that you've done. So same thing with stereotypes, cliches that are used. Okay, sometimes we use cliches in our language or in our cultures, and those sayings or those commonly overused sayings, that's what cliche means, are really specific to our culture. So maybe bring up why you've used those cliches if you have used them. Bring up any proverbs, any cultural sayings you've included, any specific language or words that you've used with positive or negative connotations. Any slang that you've used as well can also help there. Okay, so obviously if you're speaking to an audience of year 8 students, you may have chosen to use certain language or certain words that they understand, like colloquial slang language, or words from social media. Okay, why did you include those words? Obviously to better relate to your audience, to bring a humorous effect. Okay, it's always funny when someone a little bit older uses a word that is being used by a younger generation. Okay, so it could have been, that could have been your effect. Look, not all of you may have used all of these. I've just listed a bunch of different creative literary techniques here, but just see which ones, or think about which ones you've included. You're anyway getting your SAC 1 back tomorrow, so you can quickly look over it if you need to. But yeah, just try to think about which creative techniques you used and why you used them as well. Okay, so I'll just quickly go through them just to, yeah, humor, alliteration, use of direct address or call to action. This is a very good one for speeches. Okay, if you've said, okay, let's work together to, you know, to make people feel proud of who they are and proud of themselves and not feel ashamed of the journey that they're going through and the struggles and the setbacks that they're having. That's a call to action. Do we need to mention every single technique used? So look, the more you can give and the more justification you can give, the better it is. But look, if you're using like a technique repeatedly, obviously it means something to you. So if you're constantly using rhetorical questions, obviously that is significant. So you must bring that up. If you're using like a technique just like once and it's not really something that's that important to you personally, you don't need to include it. So you don't have to mention every single one used. See how much writing you end up getting. If you feel like your language like paragraph is quite like less, then you can obviously just add another technique in there. It's all about not just listing techniques though, guys. You need to describe why you used it. That's more important. The why is the most important thing, okay? The explanation. Okay, another question. If I have used a Quran verse, is that known as an allusion or literary technique? It's, yeah, you can just call it a Quranic reference. You could call it an allusion. It's like, yeah, that should be okay. You can just call it a religious reference or a reference to a holy book. Should be okay. Do I have to talk about why I used my tone? Yes, you do need to bring up the idea of why did you use a specific tone for your audience? Obviously, if you're speaking to a bunch of year 7s or grade 6s, you need to explain why you use maybe a little bit of a lighthearted tone with them. Like I can't go all into a grade 6, classroom and be like, okay, guys, like you need to be really stressed about your future. It's all doom and gloom from here. Like you need to realize that they are children at the end of the day, and you need to adjust your tone to make it like, more manageable for them. So yes, you do need to explain why you used your specific tone in reference to the specific audience that you had. Another question, how would we divide all these into paragraphs? Just have one paragraph per component. So one paragraph for form, one paragraph for language, one for audience, one for purpose, one for context. Okay. That should be more than enough. Under language, if you want to then divide that paragraph into like little subheadings, like for example, creative techniques used, certain words used. I don't mind you doing that. Like you can do that if you like, but just try not to write in dot points, guys. Write in continuous sentences, because this is going to be marked like an essay kind of, thing. So it does need to be properly structured and written nicely. Okay, another question. What would the audience be for a personal essay? Because it wasn't. Look, this is your choice. Obviously, with Red Plastic Chair, Amy Young's Red Plastic Chair was actually published in the SBS website as part of like an anthology of other short stories and other personal reflective essays. If you like, you can just say that your piece was in a similar situation, that your piece was also published in an anthology of personal reflective essays to be published in The Age or to be published on the SBS website. I don't know. So you can just do it like that. Generally, personal essays need to have an audience. So just try to visualize, just try to think about what kind of a publication material your essay might have been published in. Okay, so let me go back to this one. Okay, wait, another question. But we can do one paragraph per component. Is it better to do? Just do it one paragraph per component. That's going to be easier for you guys. I can't think of another format anyway. So yeah, just do one paragraph per component. Leave a few lines underneath. Like if you do the paragraph of form and you're going to move to the language, leave at least maybe 2, 3, or 4 lines before you start the next paragraph. So in case you think of something and you want to quickly come back, you can just chuck it into like the whatever leftover space you had there, instead of stressing. Because sometimes you do think of extra stuff that you want to write before you submit. And rather than squeezing it in and having no space, just leave maybe 4 lines in between each paragraph, just as a tip. We're going to obviously give you a very big booklet with lots of papers, so you don't need to stress about running out of paper. And I will bring extra tomorrow as well. So yeah. Okay, hold on, I need to close this. All right, so where was I? Oh yeah, so these are all the creative techniques, guys. So just think about which ones you have used. Remember, I also gave you a big table, big PowerPoint of creative techniques. It's on Schoolbox, and I printed that for you. You can also look at that table, because some of the techniques in that table I have not listed here. So obviously have a look at both and just try to think about which ones you have included. Remembering you're not allowed to bring any material into tomorrow's SAC. So you need to have a review of those PowerPoints and things at home and before your SAC. You can't bring anything into the SAC. So try to like memorize whatever you can. Okay, so yeah, so that's basically the tone, and the language you use according to that tone also comes under language, the language paragraph, okay? Your third paragraph will be about audience. And so obviously in the language, right towards the end of the language paragraph, you might discuss the kind of language you've used for your audience. And then you nicely kind of transition into, well, who were your actual audience for this piece? Who did you have in mind as the audience if you're doing a speech? Or your readership, if you've just published something like a personal reflective essay or you're writing a letter, who is your reader? Okay, so when you wrote this piece, why did you choose this audience? For example, if you gave a speech, why did you choose your audience to be a bunch of grade sixes? You might, I'm just going off the top of my head here, but you might say that when I was in grade six, I really felt like a struggle with my identity. I didn't know what my journey would be. I didn't have an idea. So I didn't want the grade sixes of today's generation to feel the same. I wanted to be there to clarify things for them. Okay, so they wouldn't have to feel the same way I felt. I don't know. It's just like, it's up to you. Okay. Why is your piece so relevant for this audience specifically? So that means when you wrote your specific essay, or when you wrote your specific creative piece, why did you specifically choose that audience? And is it because that audience was similar to you in anything? Were they similar to you in terms of age? I know a lot of you who were doing at least the practice essays with speeches, you started off with a VCE audience. And obviously that makes sense because you guys are in VCE yourself. So is the audience similar to you in terms of age, in terms of cultural background? Cultural background you can bring up if you've done a speech to a bunch of newly arrived migrants who are from the same country that you are culturally or ethnically from, okay? Obviously, there's a lot of common connections that can be made. Are they of a similar educational level to you? So if, for example, you are only giving your speech to year 12 students, or you're only giving your speech to students in second year of university, and you're also in second year, let's say, where are you giving your speech? Okay, the location is actually just as important as the audience themselves. For example, with the migrants example I just gave, a lot of migrants, they spend a lot of their time in community centers, okay, trying to assimilate into the community. So if you had done that and given a speech, most likely your speech would have been in a community center, okay? If you were giving your speech to VCE students, most likely your speech would be in school because that's the majority of time where VCE students spend their time. If you were giving your speech to a bunch of like university second year students, it would most likely be in some like university lecture theater because that's most likely the most convenient location for this audience to meet. Social role or social occupation. So what kind of a job do these people have? For example, are you giving a speech to a bunch of teachers? Are you giving your speech to a bunch of doctors? Who are you giving your speech to? Do they have a specific occupational role? And why did you choose that? Or simply, do they have a common interest to yourself? So that could also be a reason why you have chosen that specific audience for your piece. So if you're talking about your up and coming journey of becoming the next biggest sports star, you might have chosen a bunch of students in one of the many sports academies our school now has, okay? And those students, because they're all sports minded and they're all like oriented towards sports and, becoming the next big thing, you might give your speech to them to inspire them to, keep at it, even though times get hard. You are going to develop your athletic skills and you can eventually, surprise yourself or something like that. So that's for audience. And then we come to purpose. So purpose of the writing is, why did you write this piece? What were you attempting to achieve? In other words, what was the point? Okay. Obviously, when you write something, you've put effort into it. You've put some level of thought into it. There is a purpose or a point behind it. It has significance. So what were the main messages or ideas, obviously about personal journey, that you were trying to convey or relay to your audience? Okay, that is the purpose. Remember, your purpose needs to be connected to personal journeys because obviously that's the ideas that you have brought up in your piece, and that is what a personal framework is about according to the outcome too. So Vika also has given a few purposes for creative writing. So in the paragraph where you talk about purpose, you should also mention, and remember, you may have hit upon one or more of these. It doesn't necessarily only have to be one. With your writing, were you trying to just express an idea, just basically state it out and that's it? Were you trying to explain an idea or explain something about personal journeys? Were you reflecting on something that happened to you in the past or some personal journey you've gone through or someone else has gone through and you're just thinking about it after the fact? Or are you trying to persuade and argue something? Okay, so that's the idea. Okay, I've got the 10-minute timer coming up. Okay, so was it one or was it a combination of the few is what we're really trying to talk about here. Remember, if it's more than one, you just state what it is and then you explain why it was express or why it was reflect or why it was argue. Okay, so that is something important to bring up under the purpose of your writing, because obviously this is something that VCA have included in the study design on the next slide. And the context of the writing, which one of you just asked me about just before we started this PowerPoint. When you're discussing the context of your writing, guys, think about what time period you set your writing in. What was the setting? What was the environment? What were the circumstances surrounding the person or the character in your creative writing? This could involve descriptions of the time period when your writing is set. I know some of you, for example, were setting your creative writing pieces in like a time of war or a time of mass migration or a time of political movement. Okay, forget political movement. Some of you were setting it in like, I'm just going off the practice pieces. Some of you were setting it in like COVID. Okay, COVID times. That was a very significant social context. Okay, of the time. It was a different time. If you are setting your creative writing amidst some important cultural event, for example, a child going from grade 6 to grade 7, moving schools, that's a very important social event. That comes under context. If you're setting your writing in terms of something happening to a person during Ramadan, like a spiritual journey, bring up Ramadan. It is a significant religious and cultural event for all of us. Okay. If you're setting it during Eid, okay, or if your character is Christian and you're setting it during Christmas or Easter or whatever it is, bring those things up, because obviously, who we are and what we do changes during those events, in other words. Okay, so that's kind of important to talk about. It's also important to describe when your writing is set. Example, if you're setting your writing in the 1800s and your character is female, there may be instances where their personal journey is limited because people look down on them when they say, I want to get a job, or people look down on them when they say, I want to get educated, because back then women did not have as many rights as they do today. So that's something that you might discuss or you might bring up, okay? And you might talk about how setting your writing in that specific time period, setting amidst that cultural or social event, how that then affected the person's personal journey. Because remember, we're linking everything back to personal journey. Under context, we also then talk about the mode that was used, okay? So is the mode that you're using, is it like a kind of like, what do we call it? Is it like a publicly published kind of piece of writing, or is it privately done? Also, you might discuss how formal or informal your creative writing is. If it's a speech and you're using a lot of slang and you're just being kind of casual with it, it's obviously a little bit more informal. If it's a letter that you're writing to your local councillor to get them to, look at the racism happening in the community and how it affects people's abilities to grow and affects people's personal journeys, obviously you can't be slang with that. You have to be a bit more formal. So obviously, you should know how formal or informal your written piece is and explain why you chose to be informal or why you chose to be formal. And also, obviously, whether your creatively written text is something that you're going to be publishing. For example, before I talked about the idea with personal reflective essays, we sometimes publish them in newspapers and magazines. So is that being published somewhere, or is that going to be remaining private? Okay, remember, sometimes even of some of our more privately done forms, for example, diary entries, can eventually get published and become books. So it doesn't mean that just because your diary entries are meant to be private, that they have to be kept private. If you think that you'd be happy to publish them in a magazine to show your journey, and that's not something you're ashamed of doing, or that's not something you feel hesitant to do, that's something you can bring up in your context then, that, these diary entries will later be published or are to be published in a local magazine or are to be published and collated to become a book. So that's kind of something you might consider as well. Okay, this slide took a long time, but there's so much to go through. All right, this is all the information from the VCAR study design, guys. Everything is basically the 4 things that I said with purpose. Where is it? Express, explain, reflect, argue. They're here in dot points. So in case you don't know what they mean, they're pretty self-explanatory, but always good to read through them again just to see what VCAR means by them. And then you can obviously tick them off and be like, oh yeah, I did this, or no, I didn't do this. And then you can, before tomorrow's SAC, you can kind of mentally be like, okay, well, my purposes were, let's say, explain and argue. Okay, and you can have that in mind ready to go. Okay, so I gave you guys this these sample essays. I put the first page of it so you'll kind of recognize it. At the end of these two creative sample tasks, they're also on Schoolbox, by the way. You've got a commentary, okay? This commentary is not a full FLAPC, and I told you this at the time I gave this to you a few weeks back. It's not a full FLAPC, but it gives you at least a bit of an insight into how you might write or how you might express, how you might use the word I, for example, first person, how you might incorporate how you've gained inspiration from one of the mentor texts. What about the mentor text did you gain or get inspiration from? For example, this commentary, reflective commentary from sample personal essay 1 talks about the idea that they take inspiration from Amy Jung's piece of the way she uses the red plastic chair as a motif, as a constantly repeating symbol in her text. Okay, so that's something that she brings up. If you were inspired by Adichie's use of anecdotes, and that's something that you then use to write your own speech that also contain many anecdotes, you might write that you took inspiration from Adichie's speech. Okay, so that's kind of like the idea. So she's mentioning a bit about language here. She's mentioning a bit of the mentor text. Remember, you don't have to write like form ... It doesn't have to be in any specific structure, but we give you FLAPC as a sample structure. Okay, and this is the commentary from the second sample essay in that booklet I gave you. Again, you can see I took inspiration from, so you can use the word I, you can keep it simple. You don't have to use fancy language here, guys. We just want to know nicely what were your explanations for the choices you made when you did SAC 1. Okay. Any questions, guys? In fact, what I might do, because I've officially finished the PowerPoint, I'm going to stop the recording here.